Okay, so welcome everyone for our final session of this online session on Blue Trifectas, which is co-sponsored and co-run by Apex at Yale and BESI at Berkeley. Thanks to the panelists and the audience for staying with us. The final session that we have now is going to explore Blue Trifecta's governance through the lens of decarbonization. Unlike housing, which we just discussed, climate is an issue with a clear partisan valence. Democrats are, at least in rhetoric, the party of using public policy to promote fast decarbonization. Yet in practice, when we look at the deployment of clean energy, Democrat-controlled states on the whole are not doing a whole lot better than Republican-controlled states, although it depends on the metric you use. So today, we have a fantastic group of panelists here to discuss how Democratic Party politics have shaped decarbonization policy and implementation, particularly in Blue Trifectas. I'm going to introduce the panelists briefly here in the order they will speak. First, we'll have Will Tour, who is the Executive Director of the Colorado Energy Office, where he leads efforts to advance the state's transition to a clean energy economy. He was previously a Boulder County Commissioner and also Mayor of Boulder, and also has a PhD in physics. Will has a lot of responsibilities and is going to have to leave our panel a little bit early, just as a heads up. Next, we'll hear from Dave Weiskopf, who is the Senior Policy Director at the Climate Cabinet, which is a fairly new organization that works to find and promote under-the-radar climate champions in local politics. He was previously Senior Policy Advisor at NextGen Policy, working on climate and energy issues primarily in California. Third, we'll have Lara Skinner, who is the Executive Director of the Climate Jobs Institute at Cornell University's Labor Relations School. Under her direction, Cornell has designed a jobs-led climate programs for 10 US states, and she was instrumental in building the labor coalition in New York in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy. She has worked for unions doing campaign research and policy work for over 25 years. And finally, we'll have Sam Ricketts, who is the co-founder of S2 Strategies, which is a climate-focused consulting firm. He previously co-founded and led Evergreen Action, and previously Sam was the climate director for Jay Inslee's 2020 presidential campaign and worked closely with Inslee on climate policy in Washington state. So just for the run of show, after the initial remarks, I'm going to facilitate a short discussion before moving to take questions in the Q&A. So feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A box whenever they come up. So we've asked the panelists to start by each responding to the following prompt. In recent years, and in the state or states you are most familiar with, how has the governing Democratic coalition tried to accelerate decarbonization? What has worked and what hasn't, and why? And how have Democratic coalitional politics shaped the policies enacted and their effects? We'll start with Will.
Thank you. So I joined the Colorado Energy Office in January of 2019, right at the point where Jared Polis had just been elected governor and our state Senate had just shifted from a Republican majority to a Democratic majority. So sort of incoming blue trifecta. And there was a lot of pent-up demand for action on clean energy and climate. And really starting with that legislative session, we began sort of creating the framework for deep decarbonization in the state. The approach was to both set targets. So very quickly we passed legislation setting goals of cutting greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2030 from a 2005 baseline, and of a 90% reduction by 2050 that has since been updated to a net zero target, as well as a wide variety of sort of sector-specific policies that began to be put into place. After the passage of that legislation, Governor Polis asked the Energy Office to lead the development of a state greenhouse gas roadmap that would really be the strategic plan for how the heck do we meet the targets that we have set for ourselves. And what became clear pretty quickly was that there were a handful of sectors that were responsible for most of the emissions in the state, that it was really electricity generation, transportation, industrial emissions, methane emissions from our oil and gas industry, and burning gas in buildings were our sort of five largest sources that were somewhat tractable. There's also a significant amount of emissions from agriculture, probably our sixth largest source, but a little harder to address. So we primarily focused on those five major sources of emissions and began building a set of policies that combined regulatory strategies, public investment, and incentives for both individuals and businesses in an effort to achieve kind of market transformation. I would say that this was an arena where there was certainly some disagreement among various Democratic constituencies about how to address this, with some folks from the environmental community wanting a much larger focus sort of purely on the regulatory side. But as an administration, we made the decision to really focus on this combination of sort of regulatory investment and incentives. A core piece of the transition is certainly the transition to clean electricity. Historically, our largest single source of emissions, Colorado was a very coal-heavy state. If you were to go back less than 2 decades, we were more than 70% coal. We're now on a trajectory to all coal being retired by the end of this decade, have cut coal use in half, and replaced it all essentially with new wind and solar, maintaining approximately the same percentage of gas generation that we've had in the past. And we have a regulatory structure that requires our utilities to develop clean energy plans that achieve at least an 80% emission reduction by the end of the decade, and are currently in discussions about sort of extending that legislation and creating a 2040 clean energy standard. The other sort of key piece to this is that we can maximize the emissions reductions by using that clean electricity to replace use of fossil fuels in other sectors. So in transportation, we've really put together a pretty broad-ranging set of strategies that include investment in charging stations, strong state tax credits for both light and medium and heavy-duty electric vehicles, and regulatory requirements, although those are likely to be rolled back in the near future by federal action that require auto and truck manufacturers to gradually ramp up the percentage of zero-emission vehicles that they sell. We've seen a lot of success in this arena. We're up to between 25 and 30% of new vehicles being EVs in the state, and have really significant investment continuing to move us in that direction. On the industrial and oil and gas sides, the focus has been much more regulatory, with regulatory requirements for more than a 60% reduction in methane emissions from the oil and gas industry, and a set of greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements for our large manufacturers in the state, combined with a set of incentives on the manufacturing side through competitive industrial decarbonization tax credits that we think are going to lead to significantly exceeding our industrial sector goals for the 2020s. Still a lot of work to do to figure out what is the pathway to net zero on the industrial side, sort of post 2030. And then on the building side, we've done a combination of tax credits and incentives for businesses and individuals to move towards lower emissions buildings and deep retrofits, a statewide building code requirements and building performance standard requirements for the BPS requirements being for large commercial buildings, and then a clean heat requirements that require our natural gas utilities to achieve a 22% emission reduction by the end of the decade through programs that are approved by our Public Utilities Commission that to date have largely focused on support for customer-facing electrification and energy efficiency, and we're in the process uh, of setting the post-2030 targets for those gas utilities. When we put it all together, we think that we are on a pathway to almost achieving our 2030 targets. Our modeling suggests we'll achieve about a 49% emission reduction as opposed to the 50% target, but a lot of work still to do to figure out that sort of post-2030 trajectory. The one other piece that I would put in there, that a major focus of our governor on this work has been to make sure that we are doing this in a way that improves the lives of individual Coloradans. So there is we have by and large rejected policies that might be effective at emissions reductions, but would have the effect of increasing the cost of living for everyday Coloradans, and have really focused on strategies that will either reduce costs or at least not increase the cost of living. We're more okay with imposing costs on industry, but much less so okay with imposing costs on ordinary individuals. The other piece that I would say has been a core part of our climate strategy, especially the last couple of years, has been a focus on housing policy. Colorado, as with many other states, faces a crisis of housing affordability driven largely by not building enough housing. And we also see that as a major source of emissions in the transportation sector, as it forces people to live very far from where they need to be on a daily basis, and tends to lead to new housing construction being single family housing in the exurbs that has high building energy use. So a major focus over the last couple of years has been both starting to create more investment in our transit system and removing regulatory barriers to building housing in cities. So the last couple of years, there has been first an unsuccessful effort and then a very successful effort to essentially make it illegal for cities to ban accessory dwelling units, ban higher occupancy, remove the ability of cities to impose parking minimums near transit, and requiring zoning for at least 50 units per acre along our transit lines. And that's been a pretty significant part of our climate focus over the last couple of years. That is certainly something that has divided Democratic constituencies to some extent, but has also been almost completely partisan. Essentially, all votes for housing and land use reform in the state, with the exception of one Republican vote on occupancy limits and one on accessory dwelling units, have been sort of completely partisan votes to date. So that gives sort of a picture of where we're at.
Thanks so much, Will. I'm really glad you brought up many of those things, including affordability and cost of living. Dave is next.
Thanks very much, Sam. Thanks for that presentation, Will. I will share my screen so that you can see the presentation. And so sorry, my presentation window has vanished.
Those are nice redwoods, though.
Thank you very much. Let me try something a little bit different.
There we go.
Okay, and I will just exit this presenter view. You guys, this is awfully fun. I did lots of practice beforehand to make sure that it would go exactly this way. Um,
Do you want to go to Laura and then we can come back to you?
sure, that'll be just fine. Thanks.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, Sam, and big thanks to the Berkeley Economy and Society Initiative and the Yale American Political Economy Exchange for hosting this great convening, and I really appreciate being a part of it. On my part, and Sam, you mentioned this in the introduction. I've worked with a number of U.S. states, blue states to help them develop what we call sort of a climate jobs roadmap and plan to tackle the climate crisis and make sure that we're building an equitable clean energy economy with good jobs and more equitable access to those jobs and just generally a more fair and just economy. And so based on that work that we've done, and we're working in about 20 states now, I have kind of three main reflections or thoughts that I would share on how states have approached climate work and what I see as kind of working or not working. And I'm going to focus mostly on the energy sector because that's where I have the most experience, and it's also where I think, in most cases, it's where there has been the most progress in decarbonization. So the first offer I would make is that emissions reduction mandates or goals, which is what most states have implemented to address the climate crisis, are important, but they're not enough. I think that states need to have concrete roadmaps and goals for what they need to build that are pretty technology specific. So I think in most states, when you look at what does the suite of climate and energy policy look like, it looks like, reducing greenhouse gas emissions by a certain percentage by a certain time. It, may be, procuring a certain percentage of renewable or clean energy by a certain time. And then it may be like a cap and invest or cap and trade program where, companies that are producing emissions pay a fee if they're not falling below that cap. And so, again, I think these are important, but I don't think that they're enough. They're goals, but they're not a roadmap for how states actually meet those targets. And the reality is most states are not reaching their goals or even coming close on emissions reduction or in the amount of renewable and clean energy that they need to produce, especially as we see energy demand and electricity demand rapidly increasing in most states. I also think that if we think about how we build broad public support for this transition and climate policy, we have to focus on an approach that really speaks to workers, to communities, and to the general public around what the benefits of this transition are. How will this actually support and help working class communities, communities of color, as we make this transition? And I think, most people want to support a transition because it will benefit them through access to good jobs, lower utility bills, having access to cleaner air and water, being safe from storms and climate impacts. But that really needs to be sort of the messaging that we used, and the policy needs to be designed around that. When we have worked with coalitions of unions and other allies in states, we have supported science-based emissions reduction goals, but also have added requirements for how much of each technology needs to be built. And this just puts a much more granular and concrete sort of lens on what this transition means. How much offshore wind are we building? How much onshore wind are we building? How much utility scale solar or distributed solar, thermal energy networks? Like, what are we building? How much is it going to cost? What type of workers will we need to complete these projects? How many jobs will it create? What sort of workforce skill planning do we need to do to get ready for these build out, right? Like, this conversation becomes much more concrete if we have a roadmap for how a state's going to actually meet those goals. So I think that's a really important part of how we think about meeting these goals. It's also really important to being able to hold the states accountable to whether they're actually meeting those goals and whether they're building the amount of renewable and clean energy that needs to be built. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. In New York, back in 2018, they passed legislation to build 9 gigawatts of offshore wind, 10 gigawatts of solar. A lot of the states where we have been working and where there are climate jobs coalitions have set megawatt and gigawatt targets for distributed solar installations on public schools and buildings. So when they think about, how much solar do we need to install, look at all of the schools. What's the space that we have above parking lots and rooftops? And, how much solar can we actually install? How much of the school's power is that going to be meeting? So getting very specific about it, right? Because then that really translates into a specific conversation around the number and type of jobs and the kind of broad benefits that it will bring. Same thing on thermal energy networks. New York passed a law called the Utility Thermal Energy Network and Jobs Act, and it specifically says how many thermal energy networks will be built in a certain time period, and the number of households they will serve. So, and I think like the other point that's really important here is this is about like what are we building up? Like how are we building the climate safe economy and infrastructure that we need rather than focusing on what we're shutting down. And of course, there's going to be phase out of industries, but I think it's really hard for folks to get behind and really support this transition if they don't see kind of the broad benefits that making this transition will bring, including like a big one, is it creating local jobs? Like what are we building and what sort of local jobs are going to be created by this transition? So that's one thing. The second thing I would point out is just the importance of climate policy and climate goals, decarbonization goals, including jobs and equity standards. I would say that the first generation of climate and energy policy that we saw in the US and a number of states didn't include any jobs or equity standards on the investments that would go into clean energy. And, this is a big problem, right? Because it assumes that all we need to do is reduce emissions. The reality is we're facing a climate crisis, but we're also facing a crisis of inequality, right? Inequality of income, of wealth, of, power, race, gender, hope, opportunity, all of those things. And we have to make sure that our climate policy is actually a climate policy that benefits frontline working class communities of color and is taking on that crisis of inequality that we're facing in the country. And around 2019, we started to see a number of states, because of coalitions of unions, community groups, environmental justice groups, and others, started to push hard for including worker and equity-centered climate policy, right? Building out worker and equity standards in states' climate policy. And this means that, we're setting climate goals that include standards for how much workers will be paid, training apprenticeship requirements, the ability to organize into a union without employer interference, targeting investments to frontline environmental justice communities, potentially sending back benefits to the most energy burdened communities in a state. So that was a pretty significant shift in how states were doing climate policy. There's labor standards on clean energy investment and work in at least 10 states, probably more now. I'd have to do a survey to see kind of where we're at on that. But it's becoming something that's much more a standard way that blue states are doing climate and energy policy. And I would say that a lot of what we saw at the state level was then sort of a foundation for what then happened with the Inflation Reduction Act, right? So the Inflation Reduction Act incentivized the build of solar, wind, other clean energy projects, and it added significantly more investments if developers and companies paid prevailing wage, used union labor, invested in frontline environmental justice or former energy communities, or used component parts that were made in the US and created jobs in the US. So that state policy was really sort of, I think, a basis for then what was passed in the Inflation Reduction Act. So first thing is like setting concrete goals. Second thing is making sure that we have strong job and equity standards in the climate policy that we're building. And then the third thing I would say is that the vast majority of climate policy has been what I would call sort of market-driven policy rather than state or state government-driven policy. And I think there's, pretty significant implications to that. It means that to meet these goals, we're relying on the private markets and companies proposing and building projects. The IRA is a great example of this. Companies and developers receive tax breaks on the build of projects. And in the case of the Inflation Reduction Act, the credits were so significant that it really encouraged developers to build projects. And we saw a massive increase in the number of clean energy projects that were happening around the country. But it is leaving addressing the climate crisis, reducing emissions, building this climate safe infrastructure we need up to the market, which thus far, and most likely, I think, in the future, is not enough to drive the sort of massive shift that we need to see right now to deal with the emissions reductions, the sort of the pace and scale of emissions reduction that we need to make. A couple things I would note here just before wrapping up. Are we seeing some shift in this? We are seeing some interesting things around kind of what state-driven policy would look like. New York passed something called the Build Public Renewables Act a couple of years ago. This empowers the New York Power Authority, NYPA, New York's public power entity, to build, own, and operate its own renewable and clean energy projects. And we're starting to see those projects move forward. And obviously doing that allows for much easier access to low interest loans and funding, and a much clearer role for the state to direct, monitor, and ensure what projects are being built, when and where, and whether the state's meeting its climate goals and targets. The other thing I think that is really important about this is a lot of the work that needs to be done in the clean energy space will happen in the residential sector. And thus far, most of our policy to drive that work has been incentive based, right? Providing households, homeowners incentives to install solar panels, put in an EV charger, put in a heat pump. And the reality is that rollout is pretty inequitable, right? The vast majority of families in the US don't have the resources to pay for those upgrades, even if there is incentivization. And so having the state, some sort of public entity, whether it's at the city, state, or federal level, play some sort of coordinating and aggregating role to get that work done at a neighborhood scale, I think is really important to making it more equitable, making it more accessible to energy burdened communities, but also just increasing the scale of the work that we're doing. We need the vast majority of homes in the US to be decarbonized, to have solar panels, to be have EV chargers. And also that means that we're benefiting the largest segment of working families who need those benefits the most, right? Who need lower utility bills, who need to have, a more affordable way to get to work, all of those things. So there's a really big piece there of state-driven policy that then really helps to accelerate the pace and scale of work that we're trying to do and make it more equitable. So I'll stop there with just those kind of three thoughts on what's been happening.
Thanks so much. So much to unpack there. All right, Dave, I'll turn it back to you if you're ready.
I am, thanks. Is that coming through okay?
Yep.
All right, thanks very much. So I will focus primarily on California in this presentation. I want to actually start by looking at the conditions in 2022 and really ask the question whether this was or can be prevented from being the high watermark for climate policy in this state. And that year we had a very large budget surplus. And the IRA had not yet actually been passed, but this was probably the biggest year that California has had for climate policy. So that involved making a commitment for a $54 billion 5-year investment in climate on the deployment side, plus some really interesting policy on the legislative side. What happened is almost immediately, it became clear that that high watermark would start to recede in 2023, 2024, 2025. We started seeing rollbacks, particularly from the investment commitments. A lot of that money was front-loaded, but what started out as a $54 billion 5-year commitment ended up as a really only $31 billion incremental commitment above and beyond what would go to climate anyway through cap and trade funds. And that is spread out over the course of 8 years rather than 5 years. So the effectiveness of that policy, still very big, still very good, was diluted from that high watermark. I think the theory here in part that the IRA and federal policy would help to backfill a lot of this investment. We'll see now. Just to sort of put that year in context, if we kind of look at the history of major climate policy enactment in California, 2022 saw that $54 billion commitment plus the enactment of our carbon neutrality law, which is paired with a 85% GHG reduction target for 2045. So that means that carbon neutrality is achieved at least through 85% emission reductions, and at most 15% through removals. Our 100% clean energy standard was updated to set an interim goal of 90% by 2035. Some controversy around the fact that the Diablo Canyon nuclear plant received a legislative life extension, but there's also a major win for equity and for just transition by establishing drilling buffer zones near sensitive receptors like schools and homes, nursing homes, medical facilities, as we begin to manage the wind down of the fossil fuel extraction industry in California. But for the period about 3 years before 2022 and 3 years after, really what we saw were good, very difficult to pass, but relatively small measures, not the sort of economy-wide level of ambition that we saw in 2022 or with these kind of banner bills like the 100% clean energy target, the economy-wide target in 2016. Looking at this year to say, well, it's been 3 years, maybe we're doing something big again. It's not looking great. Two of the biggest policies that have been proposed are not in great shape. Legislature is still in. One was the proposal for the Polluters Pay Climate Superfund, which would directly require fossil fuel companies to pay for damages that are caused in the course of their business. This is sort of modeled on the lead paint fund. They were doing something that was legal at the time that caused damages, and now we're looking back and saying it is not fair that they made money off of this, but the state is paying, or that individuals are paying for the harm that's been done. That bill was attempted last year and failed. This year it was pulled from committee in the first house and could still come back. We'll see. Another big bill was the insurance subrogation for fossil fuel catastrophes. This would allow insurance companies to sue for recovery for payments that they make in, say, the LA fire, which is associated with climate change. Insurance companies could recover from fossil fuel companies under this bill. That bill has also failed. Right now, the state is working to reauthorize cap and trade. There's a long history there. I did a long thread on this on Blue Sky recently that we could get into if you like, but the program was last reauthorized in a manner reminiscent of the dynamic that Laura described, where essentially primarily the equity provisions that were being sought were not really fully taken into account in 2017. That has really set the stage for a much more difficult dynamic this year as they begin to look at reauthorization. And we're really seeing that the advocates for more stringent environmental outcomes and equity are being placed in opposition to the governor and the oil industry, who have both been pushing for maintenance of the status quo approach. So it's not the productive dynamic that we would hope to see in a supermajority Democratic trifecta state, where basically every politician professes to really prioritize climate and equity. One bright spot, potentially, is that we are seeing a lot of progress on housing policy, and we've seen this progress over the course of the last 10 years. I do have a real question about this. Will mentioned in Colorado the very good housing policy there. I would add, Will, the essential complement to that is the transportation policy that your state has adopted, and that if we pair these two policies together to really help folks have ways to get around cheaper and cleaner besides driving in a car and being stuck in traffic on a freeway, housing policy can effectively reduce emissions. If you don't do that, you risk getting an outcome like we see in places like Houston, where you can build as much as you want, but the benefits of that are cannibalized by longer commutes, more pollution and traffic. So it's not, it could be going worse, but it is not the level of ambition that one might expect if we really look at the way the political makeup of the state legislature has developed over time. We keep getting bigger and bigger Democratic supermajorities. We do not see a corresponding trend in the level of ambition, the level of equity that's built in the effectiveness of climate policy in the state. So what we're seeing instead is that while it's true that without a Democratic majority, you probably can't get much of anything done on climate, maybe a little thing here and there around the edges. But beyond a certain size, increasing the size of that majority seems to be less important than what the makeup of that caucus actually is. Are people in it who really prioritize climate, or are we seeing that actually we kind of have a dynamic where there are more mouths to feed within the caucus, and so committee chairships go to people who maybe don't share climate as a high priority. Fundraising efforts might be spread out among those more vulnerable districts, which is therefore foregrounding most often more moderate policies rather than the most progressive policy. And so we could actually end up diluting the effectiveness of the caucus if we're not careful as those majorities grow over time. This dynamic is not unique to California. We saw in Michigan with the first Democratic trifecta since 1984, they did succeed in passing a 100% clean energy standard in the state in 2022. Almost immediately, utility-led efforts to undermine that and roll that back have been pretty relentless. They've held the line mostly so far, but have not really, it's really been a game of defense since then. If that last year, for example, during their lame duck session, when they knew that they were losing that Dem trifecta in Michigan, rather than having candidates out knocking doors, the folks were passing a data centers tax credit that had no clean energy or clean water or community or labor standard safeguards. In New Mexico, we did see some progress this year with the supermajority trifecta that was achieved in 2024. But some things that really kind of should be easy in 2025 in a supermajority Dem state like New Mexico were hard, like codifying the state's carbon neutrality target, which the governor has implemented through an executive order. Getting that written into law was something that they couldn't get done this year with that supermajority. In Illinois, we have seen sort of a longer history of Dem majorities. Supermajorities and trifectas have kind of come and gone, but there has been a supermajority trifecta since 2019. We've seen some good policy there, but again, this year and last year are more difficult than you might expect. Last year, for example, there was an attempt to update the state's clean energy standard to include better policy for storage and transmission. That didn't get through. It was expected to be sort of a quick thing to do early in this session. It's taking essentially until the last week of session, which we're almost at right now. All of that attention has taken the focus away from other efforts that climate advocates were really pushing for, like really cutting edge transportation policy. We may get some improvement. We're really working hard on that to get improvement in how transit is funded and transit governance in Illinois. But other policies like DOT reform, that essential complement to housing policy, and stronger electric vehicle requirements are not in as good shape for this year. And so things are taking longer and going slower than one might expect, given these political sort of pure numbers. So why not? Simple answer is political muscle. I know we can talk about better policy design and better messaging, but ultimately legislators respond to political interest and their own values. And where a legislator sees climate as a nice to have rather than a must have, there is a strong need for that political involvement. And we just don't see that that level of concentration. We do see that among housing advocates, and that's why they're making progress. We don't see that among transportation reform advocates, and that's why housing is moving faster than transportation reform. We still see some of the old dynamics too that I think folks are very familiar with. In California, for example, there's a very public and open alliance between the state building and construction trades and the fossil fuel industry. This is replicated in a lot of places. There are other the labor movement is not a monolith. So my apologies for saying Fossil Labor Alliance here rather than Fossil and subsegment of Labor Alliance, but the alliance is between the most politically powerful element of the labor movement, and that is more significant to the outcome than the fact that they are labor. And so again, that alignment is important. The political engagement is the essential element, though. Finally, lobbying. Members that do care about this policy still need to know what's at stake, what's on the books, who cares about it. And the public interest climate lobby is just simply outgunned. In Arizona, for example, there was one full-time environmental lobbyist in the Capitol every day and 99 there on behalf of Arizona Public Service. So there is just the need for more presence, more information. So how to fix it? There's no one weird trick. We're not going to solve this with messaging. Folks need to get involved in politics if they want to see better climate outcomes.
Dave, I don't want to cut you off, but you're a little bit over time. Can people
I'm so sorry, Sam.
slides and we can move on to Sam?
So that's it. That is my last slide. Build from your strengths. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Dave. Sam.
Awesome. Thanks, Sam. Thank you all. Thanks, Sam. Thanks to the Berkeley teams, the Yale team, and organizers of this event. Thanks to my fellow panelists for their good comments. Thank you all for tuning in today. As Sam mentioned earlier, I'm Sam Ricketts of S2 Strategies, a consulting firm that works at the intersection of federal and state climate policy, implementation, and finance. I'm typically based in Washington, D.C., but I'm beaming in from Seattle, where I grew up and where I'm from. And I'm here especially because of my role working with Governor Inslee over more than a decade in a variety of different roles, both within state policy and working with him across the nation in supporting state and local climate leadership and working on federal climate policy. Both I worked for Inslee first as a congressman on federal policy, and then 5 years in the governor's office, and then ultimately helped him when he was chair of the Democratic Governors Association, supporting state and local climate leaders, and then also one of the 20-odd members of the Democratic Party who ran for president in 2020, with his campaign very focused on climate policy. And I say all that to contextualize my comments. I'm going to talk to you first about Washington State's experience, and then a bit more about what we're seeing with blue trifectas and state climate policy throughout the country going on currently. So first of all, Washington State's experience is interesting and it's informative. It's about the need for a blue trifecta to make climate and clean energy policy happen. I mentioned I spent years working for Inslee. He was first elected to the governor's office in 2012. Took office in January 2013. And of course, from the very start, was very focused on climate action. He had written a book about the topic in the aughts. He had focused on the issue in Congress. He was a leading voice out of Obama. Quoted him when he released his Clean Power Plan, sort of the signature Obama Term 2 initiative back in 2014 or 2015. But most of the major climate policy breakthroughs happened for Governor Inslee in Washington only after a Democratic trifecta came into office, which did not happen until after the state Senate flipped in November of 2017. The state did make policy progress on certain things, creating a clean energy fund and EV infrastructure bank and otherwise, but the bulk of the breakthroughs the state has made took place only after a Democratic trifecta was again won in November 2017. It took office at the start of 2018. Since that time, Washington State has passed nation-leading climate policy, including a 100% clean electricity standard, a low carbon fuel standard, or clean fuel standard. It had previously established building codes requiring electrification for new commercial and residential buildings, something that has been lost in the ballot box, now challenged in court. We'll go down that rabbit hole now. But other leading policies like an environmental justice statute, the HEAL Act, pro-clean energy and good jobs, union jobs policies like clean energy tax credits tied to labor standards requiring use of registered apprentices or project labor agreements for projects, policies that would eventually go on to inform federal policy constructs. And then ultimately, Washington State 2022 adopted the Climate Commitment Act, an economy-wide cap and invest program that both is intended to reduce emissions and derives revenue for reinvestment into equitable solutions. As I mentioned, a number of these policies Inslee used to put forward to help inform federal policy, and he did that looking at Washington State's own experience and what Washington State borrowed from other states with the federal government could borrow from other states. And point of this here is that, all of the progress that Washington State was able to make flowed downhill from having a Democratic trifecta. Really, I mean, that was the breakthrough of the climate policy it's been able to make in recent years. Inslee left office at the end of 2024. There's a new governor, Bob Ferguson, now. Remains to be seen where the state plans to go next on climate, but it's not as rich of a policy discussion currently. I will say it all flows downhill from this, what David Roberts in 2019 called the one weird trick in passing climate policy, which is electing a Democratic trifecta. But it wasn't only a Democratic trifecta, of course, that was able to, and in this way, Washington State's experience is replicated by other states who maybe at the end of the 2010s got a chance to win a Democratic trifecta. And we've seen since then a gush of certain climate policy making in certain states. And that's running aground in certain places. And I'm going to talk about that in just a second, but a little bit more about Washington State's own experience first. It was not a fait accompli that once Washington had a trifecta, it was going to embrace ambitious climate policy. Anything but, right? I think there's several different factors that went into why it did advance climate policy. I mentioned Inslee's leadership. He had been working at the grindstone for a while before they even had a trifecta in order to pass something. But of course, you need legislators, perhaps from your party, like in a trifecta, to pass something. You also need them to be focused on moving the ball. And it wasn't the first year of getting the trifecta that the major policy breakthroughs started to happen. Those actually ran aground because the margins were so thin, because there was other competing priorities in the legislature, and the state legislators weren't as invested in it. And even there, of course, what helps you build that legislative interest, that gubernatorial interest, that private sector and lobbying interest is coalition building. And none of the policy progress Washington State would have occurred but for the coalitions that were built, both environmental advocates, environmental justice advocates, labor unions, all working together. Really in the teens, they started getting together to pass things, and ultimately with unsuccessful attempts to pass things through the legislature, unsuccessful attempts to pass things at the ballot box. The one weird trick of winning a Democratic trifecta really did open up the door for advancing policies that were supportive across the broad coalition of those entities, and also business and local governments and tribal governments in the state that were so critical in advancing the ball here. It also required being nimble. So Washington State, when it won a trifecta, Inslee had been trying to advance some form of carbon pricing in the form of mostly of a cap and invest program. I think back then we were still calling it cap and trade, but also carbon pricing, more straightforward carbon taxes. None of it had passed, of course, because of a Republican Senate that was pretty adamant that it was not going to advance any of those measures. When the trifecta was won in 2017, it meant, great, okay, good, time to go pass this cap and invest law at the start of 2018. But that bill didn't pass. I mentioned there was not big legislative majorities, and there was not strong interest, and there were some intransigent state senators in particular. So the new Democratic trifecta, though, however, was not keen to did not want to try to move a cap and invest program they knew wasn't going to pass. Instead, they turned their attention to a series of sectoral reforms, starting with a clean electricity standard, provision to go after HFCs in the industrial sector and those refrigerants, a building performance standard for the building sector, a low carbon fuel standard, and started passing sectoral based strategies before eventually laddering back into a economy-wide program with the Climate Commitment Act. And actually that two-step is a really important thing to keep in mind when it comes to trifectas. You don't try to maybe hit the home run at first. You got to get some players on base and then move them along, to use a metaphor. But ultimately, this stuff culminated in really strong success. The Democratic trifecta passed a suite of really important nation-leading laws that were validated at the ballot box. There was an attempt to repeal the Climate Commitment Act, the Cap and Invest law, at the ballot box in 2024. And the same Washington State voters who had decided not to vote for a program before at the ballot box did decide to uphold a program once it was created by the legislature, which is another interesting trick of legislating. Once you want to get voters, especially to pass something new, it can be hard. But once they have something, especially something that's providing revenues and reinvesting in services and infrastructure, they don't want that to be taken away. At least that's one of the lessons that those of us who've been focused on that ballot initiative and on the state law have learned from that. Now, other states' experiences have tracked similarly to Washington's, of course. Years of coalition building, electoral work, legislative efforts that have prepared and teed up a trifecta moment. I think we'll refer to it earlier as sort of pent up demand for climate policy that really the trifecta would unleash. And we had a gush of new Democratic legislators and governors take office in 2018. That was a year when a ton of new Democratic governors took office, that first midterm during the first Trump administration. And even in places where there already were Democratic governors or maybe new Democratic governors like Colorado, you had the legislatures split. So Washington did in 2017, a number of other states did in 2018. And since then, of course, you've seen a strong set of laws advance in states that have continued, even during the Biden administration, before it, starting 2018 and during it, you saw states taking more aggressive climate action than you'd seen in them, whether that was in Colorado, in New Mexico, in New York, in New Jersey, eventually in Minnesota and Michigan, perhaps most recently, two of the states that most recently have passed clean electricity standards and other important climate policies. That was really, and that takes us kind of closer to now. And a couple of reflections sort of about how Democratic trifectas are experiencing climate policy now and why, and then maybe a few reflections about where things go from here. Numerically speaking, Democratic trifecta state governments should be better positioned now than they have been to continue moving forward on climate policy. That even compares itself against sort of if you want to look back at the first Trump administration, early 2017, there were 16 Democratic governors in office and only 6 trifectas at the start of that administration. Fast forward to now, you've actually got 23 Democratic governors. You've got more than twice as many trifectas with 13. And you've got others that possibly may become trifectas. There's an opportunity to have become trifectas like Wisconsin in 2026. And with all this in mind, it was compelling. It was convincing, maybe even after the 2024 election, to look at these states and say, hey, state climate leadership is going to continue. You've got these places with strong trifectas. You've got governors who are members of the U.S. Climate Alliance. You've got states with decarbonization plans. Even where places where Democrats maybe lost their maybe other places where Democrats didn't have a trifecta, they broke Republican supermajorities, like in North Carolina and Wisconsin. So it opens up more opportunity for using existing executive authority. But it's been interesting because we've not seen in the last year or two states stepping up and continuing to advance the ball. We're seeing a little bit of stalling out in those places. You look at Maryland and New Jersey, especially over this last year, who have been making some important progress points, but I think would both probably say that they underperformed in the legislative efforts and policymaking efforts versus compared against what was expected of them, or maybe even what their governors had set out for themselves at the start, and maybe not advancing the clean electricity laws. Those are at least for a couple of the states that were hoping to do so. We've seen that happen in other places with Democratic trifectas.
And can you wrap up in the next minute?
Yes. Yes. Sorry. Okay. So I just want to say the last thing is why. Why is this happening? Why are we seeing Democratic trifectas not move the ball forward? One, external challenges to implementation, energy costs, RTOs, especially that are sort of overwhelming state authority. Trump administration challenging state authorities like over transportation policy, the fate of the Inflation Reduction Act. There's also internal challenges to implementation, siting and permitting challenges, compliance timelines that are activating certain industrial bases, legislative leaders bucking the trend of climate. Budgets and financing have been squeezed as compared to recent years. And then many states have also, they feel like they've kind of let the air out of the balloon. They've met the pent-up demand. There's not that pent-up demand that sits over them now. And I think that's a backdrop against the salience of where climate is in the broader Democratic coalition nationally. So, okay, lastly, what do we need to do? We need to, one, help ensure Democratic states can continue with effective implementation of the rules they've already set out for themselves, including things that are in the underbrush, like siting and permitting laws. We need to sell the policies of climate to residents based on where they are. The topic of energy costs was not factored into the climate, jobs, and justice movement from the teens on into the 20s. We need to broaden the policy toolkit, the electricity sector, where you have the opportunity with PUCs, in the transportation sector, especially with the federal government challenging tailpipe pollution laws, the use of state DOTs. Housing policy in the intersection with climate is, I think, only beginning to be an itch that is starting to be scratched. A lot of states trying out really innovative building sector policies, Colorado, of course, among them. And then, of course, there's states that need to address or need to be advancing more widespread industrial sector toolkits. And so last two things are states also need to work together. Democratic trifectas need to work together through the Climate Alliance or other means, because we don't know when we're going to get back to the mountaintop when it comes to federal policy. And in lieu of that, states need to be working not just on good policy, but on common kind of policy that can shift national markets. And then, of course, needless to say, climate is a global and nationwide challenge, and we're going to need to find ways of advancing policies in red, blue, and purple states that are not solely dependent upon Democrats having trifectas. We simply don't have the time to wait for that. That's it. Thanks, Sam. Thanks all.
Thank you so much, and thanks to everyone. So I'm gonna moderate a discussion with the panelists and then start to bring in the questions in the Q&A. Please continue to drop those questions in. Eva, can you pin all of us so we can feel a little bit more like we're in a room talking to each other? So we'll get that work done. So one thing I wanted to double click on is this question of affordability. There was a slide put up at the convening yesterday showing people have pretty negative views of Democratic strongholds like California and New York and see energy costs in those states as a big problem. So I want to start with Will and kind of ask you to reflect on kind of the challenge of implementing to reach these targets while trying to maybe achieve equity standards, labor standards, and how that affects your ability to achieve targets on time and affordably, and kind of when you're juggling a lot of balls, does that make it hard to reach these targets?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and the focus on affordability really has helped to shape the approach that we've taken to climate policy. So there are a number of policies that we looked at that we felt would have sort of direct impacts on everyday consumers that we chose not to pursue and instead to sort of take other pathways to decarbonization. And essentially we rejected most approaches in the Colorado context that focused on essentially putting a price on carbon that would then be passed on to consumers, and instead focused on how do we make either clean energy or the transition from fossil fuels to electrification cheaper for consumers, as opposed to making sort of the fossil fuel side more expensive. It's also a big part of the reason why on sort of transportation, we've really focused on how do we make sure that our transportation planning approach is really supporting GHG reductions while at the same time reducing consumer expenditures. So an example would be when we were developing our transportation GHG planning standard with our State Department of Transportation that essentially sets a GHG budget for the state and for our metropolitan regions and requires transportation plans to be able to meet those budgets. When we did the cost benefit analysis for that, what we saw was that in fact, the largest single benefit was affordability. That when we looked, for instance, at the climate benefits using social cost to carbon, those were meaningful, but the reductions in consumer fuel expenditures were about 10 times larger in the modeling than the benefits from the reduced emissions using SCC. So we've really tried to sort of have that type of analysis sort of guide the policies that we adopt. It's also a big part of the reason, I think, why we've been so excited about using housing policy as a climate lever, because the building more housing has such clear benefits for affordability in our cities. Where we see some challenges going forward is really in the electric sector. Right now we have relatively affordable electricity. Our bills are about 8% below the national average. But when we look out into the future, we worry that we could potentially see the types of increases that we've seen in a number of other states, not really driven by climate policy, but driven by, for instance, wildfire. We're going to need to make a lot of investments to address wildfire resiliency on the electric system. We have a lot of essentially deferred investment in the distribution and transmission system that are needed. A lot of these could easily lead to sort of significant rate increases over time beyond the rate of inflation if they're not really carefully managed. And while those aren't directly connected to deploying cleaner energy, they create an environment in which we have to be much more cost sensitive, I think, as we look at clean energy deployment. To date, we've been in a really fortunate situation where, because we have a lot of high cost legacy coal generation and wind and solar backed up by batteries and gas have been lower cost than simply the cost of maintaining and operating that legacy coal. We've been in a good situation where the economics and our policy goals on climate really aligned very well on the electricity side. But as we look post 2030 and really try to map out that 2030 to 2050 transition from an 80 or 85% decarbonized grid to a fully decarbonized grid, we really have some, I think, difficult questions to think about how to do that in a way that will be affordable for consumers. And there's some really interesting angles to that. It's causing us, for instance, to think a lot about sort of the role of data centers in perhaps a slightly different way, where we're thinking about could we incentivize data centers to be deployed at those places on our grid where we have excess transmission, where we have good access to clean energy, and essentially create significant new demand that would allow us to spread fixed costs of the system and fixed costs that we're going to have, for instance, for wildfire resilience over more kilowatt hours, and thus use it to actually drive down electric rates, as opposed to the other worries that we have that data center deployment could lead to higher electric rates. Also thinking about it, is there a potential to really drive co-investment in clean firm generation like advanced geothermal through partnerships with data centers? So a lot of pieces that we haven't quite figured out, but that are very much on our mind right now as we think about affordability on the electric side going forward.
Thanks, Will. Do others on the panel want to weigh in on this? I'm curious, Laura, if you've kind of changed strategies at all as people have gotten more concerned about affordability, and given that union members also pay electricity rates, and affordability can be considered an equity issue.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, we're giving a lot of thought and attention to this issue these days. And I would say one thing that we're thinking a lot more about, which I mentioned earlier, is just what more can we be doing in the kind of residential space. And so really thinking about how we can do neighborhood scale home upgrades. So if we think about what's the kind of most direct path to people using less energy, having nicer homes and lower utility bills, it does feel like that's where there's probably the most like short-term promise, right? And this is something that I think the city of Oakland did recently. They're starting a small-scale pilot project, but basically in their budget, their city budget, they said, we're going to put in a certain amount of money to do neighborhood scale home upgrades. And then through local community organizations are working with households to say, we're going to do an audit, we're going to figure out what needs to be done, we're going to install solar, maybe heat pumps, new windows and doors. Folks aren't paying the cost of this, but they'll see the benefit on their bills. So that's the type of thing where like people would see warmer homes in the winter, cooler homes in the summer, better air quality in their homes, higher home value, lower utility costs because they're using less energy or producing more energy on their own through their own generation. So just thinking again about how we aggregate and scale that work. through sort of a public entity, I think is really an important piece of all of this right now. And then, of course, for us, we're thinking about how do you unionize this work and make sure that the folks who are doing the work are being paid well, have good benefits, right? And then can afford to do this stuff on their own homes, and have access to good, health and safety training in the process. So I think, yeah, that's a piece of the affordability question that we're thinking a lot about and is really important to obviously reducing emissions. I think on the electricity stuff, it's a tricky one given the levels of deregulation and privatization of the electricity market. It's a little bit harder to see the direct path from building a ton more renewable energy to like people, seeing lower utility bills for a whole variety of reasons. We were just looking at this in New Jersey. There's been a lot of issues around utility bills going up, a big concern, for the public and in the gubernatorial race that's currently happening. And, it's like a number of things. It's not because of clean energy. New Jersey's installed a lot of solar. Its demand is going up in the state. So demand for electricity is going up because of electrification, because of, data centers, AI. So it's sort of shaking up the electricity market. There's also concern around supply constraints, right? Are some plants coming offline? Are we not going to see as many projects being built because of siting and permitting issues, interconnection, grid queue delays? And so that really showed up in the last auctions in the wholesale electricity market, where the cost of purchasing electricity there for the distributed utilities was much higher. And then folks see that on their utility bills. So yeah, I think this is, again, I'm glad you're asking this question, because I really do think that, we can't be in a position where we're saying, yeah, we got to make this transition. It's really important. And we don't know if it's going to make your utility bills lower or not, or if it's going to make your life better. I think we absolutely have to be able to say that. And we have to figure out what are the solutions that allow us to say that.
Thanks. I'm going to throw another question to the mix, but Dave or Sam, if you want to respond to either the one I'm about to pose or the affordability question, feel free to. So I'm curious if you guys could speak to the main weaknesses of blue states when it comes to decarbonization, since we usually think of blue states as the ones that are better on this. And because of the variation in the politics, should we be thinking about decarbonization trajectories in red and blue states differently based on the strengths and weaknesses of each? And is there anything blue states can learn from red states when it comes to certain elements of decarbonization?
I'd be happy to jump in, and then I'm going to have to drop. I mean, a couple of thoughts that I would have there. One is certainly around being able to build transmission and build renewables and build clean, firm generation. It's become a little bit of a truism, but you take a look at the history of renewables deployment in Texas over the last several years, which may be kneecapped by their legislature now, but they've clearly had a regulatory environment that allowed stuff to get built in a way that is a lot harder in a lot of blue states. So I think that whole permitting reform discussion is an important one. And, to give an example, this is something that we've been interested in working on in Colorado, where many of our barriers to permitting are really local barriers to permitting. And part of the reason that we haven't yet moved forward on that is because Democratic constituencies essentially wanted to place so many restrictions on any permitting reform that we would move forward. So we had partners in the environmental NGO community who are like, yeah, we love renewables, but not here or there or there or there or there. And we had partners in the labor movement who were like, yeah, but we should make sure that local governments have to adopt all these labor standards, which many local governments would not want to do before they're, as part of approving the renewables. And a little bit of, sort of the everything bagel approach that made it really difficult, and we've not yet been able to move forward on siting reform. I think that is an arena where we could learn a little bit from some of the other states.
Thank you. Dave or Sam, do you want to weigh in since you haven't spoken yet this round?
Yeah. So I think that despite Texas, having had a period of rapid renewables growth, we're not really actually seeing emission reductions in the electric sector in Texas. And that's a big problem. It's not going fast enough to displace enough fossils to actually make the line trend downward rather than, say, stay flat. That's not the case, say, in California, where we have seen rapid and sustained emission reductions in the electric sector because we have the 100% clean standard and we've had interim standards in between that we have protected and not had to defend against, say, new load growth from large new entities. Managing that new challenge, even in states that have clean energy targets, is something that blue states really need to be on the vanguard of, or else we're going to start seeing backsliding in really the only sector where decarbonization has happened kind of at all in the economy nationally. So number one, blue states take seriously the responsibility to lead and find solutions to these new challenges that allow for load to grow. We need to electrify everything, allow for new industries to come into existence while also continuing to reduce greenhouse gases from your electric sector. Number two, I really cannot say enough times, focus on transportation. Not enough states are focused on transportation. Almost no states have implemented the lowest cost, most directly impactful measures that they can to reduce greenhouse gases from that sector. It's the most polluting sector in almost every state. California has not made progress there the way, say, it has in electricity. And so while it is doing great compared to Texas on transportation, on electricity, it is doing kind of about the same on transportation, despite our aggressive EV mandates, for the simple reason that those are phased in very slowly. They're not going to bear fruit till well after the 2045 deadline we've set for ourselves as a state. So really take seriously the responsibility, again, to look at sectors beyond electricity and not just say, we have a great plan to decarbonize the economy by 2070 as fleets and other heavy industries naturally turn over and adopt clean energy and do this electricity only approach.
Thank you. Sam, do you want to weigh in?
I'd love to come in right there too. I was going to reiterate a point similar to Dave's, that the many blue states, Democratic trifecta states, have taken meaningful action, but a lot of it is pretty confined to the power sector, and the need for, we're seeing that broaden a bit, but the need for states to really recognize they need to make progress across multiple sectors, buildings, transportation, as Dave alludes to, industry and ag, as well as the power sector, is a critical thing for blue states to understand and grapple with more seriously than they are. The other thing I want to allude to was, of course, you asked about the difference between red and blue states. Red states are where most of the emissions are. I mean, other than some big kahunas in New York and in California and in Illinois and so forth, a lot of the emissions are really in southeastern states or red states, and that presents a challenge in getting after those emissions. I think a couple of different things that, though, I'd allude to. One, some of the industrial emissions, which are particularly confined to a certain number of states, will themselves implicate sort of global economic competitiveness concerns, which is an opportunity for potential red state progress in realizing that for their own OEMs and wanting to keep them on the cutting edge. And that's, I think, an interesting underexplored element of state policy engagement with the private sector and engagement with red states. The other one is energy costs and electricity costs, and the ability, like, we have the first time, that is I think, underutilized weapon in red, blue, and purple states alike right now. I mentioned how energy costs have really been at the forefront of politics and have not really been factored thoroughly into the climate jobs justice campaign and movement and policy construct over the last decade, but it really is the preeminent issue. And for the first time, really now, clean electricity, zero emission electricity, renewables is the fastest stuff to bring online and the fastest stuff to meet what is now growing load growth and demand throughout the country, and an opportunity to move the ball, not just through state legislatures, but through PUCs and citing permitting agency actions to get more clean energy deployed. It doesn't always mean a one-for-one emissions reduction in the power sector, as Dave alludes to, like in the Texas experience, but it is like it's a critical precursor to making progress in the power sector, is getting more clean energy built, and that's the solution that can really be offered seriously to American voters and consumers as the solution to both their rising electricity bills and to climate change.
Thank you. So I want to bring in an interesting question from the chat and add a little editorial to it. This is a question that Josh Bassiches and Timmons Roberts both have alluded to, which is the power of electric utilities, in particular investor-owned utilities, which we know have immense power in both red and blue states, and kind of can they be, but they're also, companies that can benefit from decarbonization and from the build out of clean energy. So do we see them as allies, adversaries? And the question I want to add to that is, it seems like the landscape of environmental organizations has kind of ballooned over the past decade with more kind of climate funding coming in, and kind of with this landscape of continued power of IOUs, with kind of the environmental lobby being bigger and potentially more resourced, like how is that changing the politics of all this in blue states?
So I think that you'll see across utilities varying positions on what they want their clean energy position to be in their portfolio, and there are a lot of factors there. I think across the board, though, it's fair to say that we're seeing a lot of opposition to the type of transparency and cost containment measures that are really going to be necessary if these are going to be the entities that will carry us into a 100% clean future. So, for example, every utility, if they can, will rate base their lobbying and political expenditures and earn a 10% or more, return on equity for paying their lobbyist or for being a member in a advocacy organization that will lobby for other increased rates. So while they can be allies insofar as they can help to build large amounts of clean energy at scale, that allyship, I think, extends as far as it extends and should not be treated as sort of a deep and personal relationship and friendship through and through. These are entities that need to be held responsible, need to be really actually put under very strong oversight if they are to continue to be the primary drivers of how electricity gets into folks' homes. I think the question as to whether a public power model, whether a ban on shutoffs and those things are appropriate to pursue is separate from that. If we take the premise that these entities are the ones that carry forward, we can't just sort of accept, well, they are good or they are bad. We need to look at all of these issues.
Thanks. Do you others want to weigh in on that, or should I throw another question into the mix? You can also feel free to use the raise hand function to indicate you want to respond to something or don't.
So Sam, I would just say I agree with all of Dave's points, and I would add, I think there's some other things that we can do too, like, we could pass legislation to have, labor, environmental justice, environmental community ratepayer advocates on the board of public service commissions, public utility commissions, on the boards of the utilities themselves. I think something like that could really help to deal with some of the issues that we're grappling with. And then, I was speaking earlier about like, okay, how do we really sort of scale, aggregate, accelerate work in the kind of residential space where utilities, play an important role and, have historically played an even greater role than they do now, right? Like it used to be in the domain of utilities to be doing work behind the meter in people's homes, and they're trusted to come in and put in new hot water heaters and, stuff like that. And so, as we think about how to do that, I think we need to explore a range of models. And I'm particularly interested in that because, of course, the utility workforce is very unionized. It's a source of a lot of really good jobs across the country, and it's important that it's unionized. Before it was unionized, 1 in 2 utility workers were dying on the job because it's really dangerous work. So, I think just like thinking about, and there's been some conversation about this in various spaces around like actually expanding the role of utilities in behind the meter work. And is that potentially kind of the fastest, quickest, most affordable way to install a lot of solar on people's homes or get heat pumps into their houses, electrify, different parts of the heating and cooling in a home. But I think we also need to be exploring, public power utilities, doing a lot of this work as well. And then like cities and states leading it as well.
Thank you. So I think I'll throw out one more question and then give you guys each the chance to respond if you want, and then we can close up because I think we're actually we kind of have till noon Pacific, but we said we would stop earlier. So, and if anyone has to leave, please feel welcome to. So there's an interesting question in the chat from Will Toasburn about if you're going to build renewables or decarbonization infrastructure using the state, you need some state capacity. And this is something that seems like a challenge in contemporary American politics. So how do we think about the ability of the state to get their act together and actually do this stuff? So that's one question you can respond to. Another I'm interested in hearing you respond to, if you like, is thinking about the national context and the extent to which you can kind of make detailed plans of decarbonization in particular states, given national policy uncertainty, and also thinking about how can these large democratic states kind of be levers of power for promoting national decarbonization. So kind of these two sides of the coin of state-federal interactions. All right. Any and all responses are welcome, and then we'll close up.
Sam, can you repeat the first question, please?
Yeah, it's just about the ability of the state to deliver on producing renewable infrastructure, decarbonization infrastructure, given state capacity challenges, given kind of issues with the state delivering public services in an effective, efficient way. I think that's mostly, I think I would be curious to hear Laura speak to that, since you've talked a bit about state-led development. Any takers?
Well, I'm happy to jump in on these. I think there are real challenges with state capacity, and we've already seen them in implementing the things that states have set out on this. We've already seen them also in states maximizing their advantage of taking advantage of the federal investments and programs that are available to them and to their communities and their companies and their consumers. That's perennially there. I think we have continuously a challenge. I think there's also a challenge with how the federal government is attacking state authority. That's an underappreciated, I think, role of this. Like, talk about making transportation sector progress. A lot of states have adopted California's clean car standards. Those are now under active assault from both Congress and the administration, which really underpin the state's ability to set tailpipe emission standards. Not just California, but in a number of states for heavy duty vehicles and light duty vehicles. I think that's another underappreciated focal point here. Blue states need to be attentive to these capacity concerns in order to be able to continue making climate progress. The other thing that you allude to about the interaction between the federal government and the states, I think looking on the bright side for a moment, a lot of focus about how state policy can inform national policy or other states or federal policy sometimes obscures the fact that state policy is needed for the actual merits of accomplishing the state policy change itself. But in reality, like, those state policy changes do ladder into national and federal policy solutions. We saw that with 2020. I mean, there was a pent-up demand for climate action, and a lot of it borrowed from 20 years of state trial and error on California laws and New York laws, Washington laws, Colorado, et cetera. Really, I think very fruitfully and substantively. We can see that happen again here, should there be another shot and a president and Congress that want to move climate action forward. They're going to be learning actively from, by 2029, let's say, they'll be learning actively from what happens or doesn't happen in states these next few years on energy affordability, on renewables build out, on housing policy, its intersection with transportation decarbonization. So like that's a critical component of this, is like reaping and sowing state policy solutions and using them for federal policy in the future.
Thanks. Other final remarks?
So I do want
Okay.
to underscore, I think, one point that Sam made earlier about states working together, and also just the power of states as their own economies. I think it's sort of often quoted California as the fourth or fifth biggest economy globally. And so states do have a lot of power, especially by, say, adopting a buy clean standard. They can create a clean aluminum industry. States that California passed a law requiring full scope carbon accounting disclosure for the world's largest corporations that do business in the state. That now is the de facto national standard, or will be when it's fully implemented, because the federal government is abandoning its standard. An interesting dynamic there is just a few weeks ago, Texas attempted to pass a law to make it illegal for companies to comply with the California law. By having a view of multiple states, folks who are looking in more than one place were able to identify resources and interested parties who worked hard in California to engage in rapid response to slow down and stop and kill that attempt in Texas to undermine that state policy. And so there's both an opportunity for states to work together to feel their own power, and there's also a need to be looking across state lines for where the actions of one state can undermine the actions of another.
Thanks. Lara, the last word if you'd like it.
Yeah, I would just say I couldn't agree more with both Sam and Dave on the need for multi-state action in this moment. I think that's really important. I mean, it's all about state action at this point, and I think the more that we can coordinate and aggregate across states, the better off we'll be. I think, offshore wind, is in a fairly precarious, space at this point. But I thought one of the most exciting things that we saw in the last year is some tri-state collaboration where you actually saw Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut working together to try to procure offshore wind and setting common standards across that work. And I just think that that kind of offers a model for how we could do a lot of other work in the clean energy sector. And Sam, on your question around state capacity, I think that's a really good one. And if we think back to kind of like New Deal era policy, right, like that was done through a combination of the state, federal government, first New York, and then the federal government, directly employing people to do the work that needed to be done. But also like a whole big chunk of that work was really about the state, putting out tenders, putting out, RFPs to have contractors bid on the work. So it was still done in the private sector, but that's very different than just saying like we have a tax credit or incentive to offer, and companies can take us up on that if we want, rather than saying we're going to build this much, power, who's bidding on it to get it done. So I just think there's a variety of ways, and it looks different for each state. In New York, we have the New York Power Authority, which is like a big state entity that has a lot of experience owning and operating energy.
Great. Thank you guys so much. This has been a fantastic panel, super generative. Thank you to the audience for your questions. All three of these sessions have been super interesting and generative. Paul or Jacob, you're welcome to jump in and say any concluding remarks, but no pressure also.
No, I'll just say thanks to everyone for this fascinating panel, and I thought it was a great complement to our discussion of housing this morning. I just want to really encourage everyone to stay involved. We'll make the recording available and be back in touch after this with follow-up activities and ideas. But this has really jump-started a rich conversation that I think we really need to have today. Paul, do you want to add anything?
Just thanks to everybody. It's been a really, really stimulating couple of days. So thanks for your participation.
All right, thanks everyone. Yeah, appreciate it.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.